So think about this for a second. What if the really big problems we face, global poverty, climate change, what if they could actually be funded if we just stopped? One thing. Today we're doing a deep dive into the politics of plunder. It's this age-old global issue of financial corruption right at the very top. We've got some really fascinating sources that unpack this whole struggle. There's one comprehensive report charting it all the way from ancient graft to, well, modern complex financial schemes. Our mission today, it's really to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge from all this material. We'll look at how this constant pressure on political systems evolved. We'll examine the staggering costs, and it's way beyond just money, and maybe surprisingly how it's sometimes forced real positive change. You'll walk away understanding just how deeply this affects societies and what the future battlegrounds look like in this fight for transparency and accountability. So let's unpack this. Where do global estimates actually put the annual financial cost of corruption? What does a number that big even mean?
It is truly a staggering figure. Our sources show global estimates putting the annual financial toll in the trillions of dollars. Trillions, that's a sum that just dwarfs the funding needed for our most pressing global challenges. But what's fascinating here, I think, is that it's not just about the huge numbers, the economics of it. It's really about the fundamental erosion of the social contract. When public money meant for schools, for healthcare, for vital infrastructure, gets diverted into the pockets of, well, a corrupt few. It's always the most vulnerable people who suffer the most acutely. That's unequivocal. And it just fundamentally undermines public trust, doesn't it? Trust in government and institutions. It creates this deep cynicism. It's what you might call a classic collective action problem. If everyone thinks others are cheating the system, well, it makes it incredibly hard for anyone to act with integrity themselves. However, our sources also show this powerful recurring cycle. You've got a big scandal, then public outrage builds, and then crucially, there's a push for reform. We'll trace that enduring struggle through history.
Okay, so this isn't new. You're saying it goes way back. Our sources trace it back to ancient Athens and Rome. What did corruption even look like back then? Especially when, public officials were often unpaid or barely paid, but still expected to shell out a lot personally just to serve.
Yeah, you hit on a really crucial point there. In those ancient societies, the lines between what was customary, like gift-giving, and what was illicit bribery were often incredibly ambiguous, blurred. Take Rome. Ambitus, that's electoral bribery. It became this massive, almost organized thing during the Republic's chaotic final years. You had aspiring politicians borrowing huge sums, maybe even contributing to serious financial instability before that civil war in 49 BCE, all to fund campaigns that, well, often involved just straight-up payments to voters. And then there was that notorious system of tax farming.
Tax farming, what was that exactly?
Well, essentially, private individuals could buy the right from the Senate to collect taxes in a certain province. And with very little oversight, they'd often just drive citizens to ruin, extracting as much as they possibly could.
Right, so given how common these things seem to have been in Rome, was there any real pushback? Or was it just kind of accepted?
Oh, absolutely not just accepted. Even back then, this kind of behavior was explicitly recognized and condemned as corrupting. Roman law had specific crimes like peculatus for embezzling state funds. And we have that famous, very dramatic example of Cicero prosecuting Gaius Verus, a governor who just notoriously extorted the people of Sicily. Cicero, he didn't mince words. He called the wealthy manipulating justice pernicious to the Republic. So it really shows us this tension, this fight between public duty and private greed. It's timeless.
Timeless indeed. So it sounds like it went beyond just individuals being opportunistic. Did these sort of ad hoc acts ever become something more organized?
Systemic? Oh, absolutely. Our sources highlight two really pivotal evolutions here. Think of them as the basic blueprints for high-level corruption that we see changing and combining throughout history. First, there was what people called old corruption back in 18th and early 19th century Britain. This wasn't just a few bad apples. It was a whole systemic network where public money was just methodically funneled to a narrow political and social elite. Through patronage, the outright sale of government jobs, crony contracting, figures like Prime Minister Robert Walpole were seen as masters of this system, where connections, not ability, got you access to state power and all the money that came with it. This was basically internal looting by the state's own insiders.
Internal looting. So old corruption was almost just part of the deal then, a deep-seated network. Did the public ever really grasp how bad it was? Did that maybe lead to a different kind of corruption?
Well, yeah. It eventually got so entrenched that public outrage did lead to major reforms. But then, in the late 19th century U.S., during the Gilded Age, we saw something arguably even more powerful emerge: state capture. This is a really critical shift. You had powerful robber barons, industrial conglomerates like the railroads just starting out, using their huge fortunes to systematically bribe politicians, lock down monopolies, get public resources on incredibly sweet terms. The Central Pacific Railroad, for instance, spent something like $500,000 a year on what were barely disguised bribes between 1875 and 1885, basically buying influence. And for a vivid example of this kind of capture, think about urban political machines like New York City's infamous Tammany Hall run by William Boss Tweed. Tweed and his cronies, they basically mastered these techniques. It's estimated they stole somewhere between $45 million and maybe even $200 million from the city.
$200 million from just one city back then. That's billions in today's money.
Billions, yes. An astonishing amount.
Did this kind of capture happen at the federal level too?
Absolutely. At the federal level, you had the Credit Mobilier scandal. That exposed how Union Pacific executives set up this sham construction company. They used it to wildly overcharge the government for building the Transcontinental Railroad. And then, to stop anyone looking too closely, they bribed powerful congressmen, even the vice president of the United States, with shares in this fraudulent company, just to protect the scheme. This marked a really critical shift historically, moving from that internal looting by state officials to external capture by powerful private interests. And these two models, internal looting, external capture, they really set the pattern for the major scandals for centuries afterward.
Right, this dual model, internal looting and external capture, it really does feel like it set the stage for corruption to just explode in scale and complexity in the 20th and 21st centuries. Our sources detail a lot of really consequential political financial scandals. Which ones really illustrate this evolution for us?
Well, the 20th century certainly kicked off with its own huge events. One of the defining early scandals was Teapot Dome in the 1920s in the U.S. Before Watergate, people considered this the greatest and most sensational scandal in American politics. It involved President Harding's Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall. He secretly leased valuable naval oil reserves, including the one at Teapot Dome, Wyoming, to his buddies in the oil industry. In return, he got about $404,000 in illicit payments. That's over $7 million today. And the most infamous part, a $100,000 cash payment from oil tycoon Edward Doheny, delivered in literally a little brown satchel, framed as a loan, of course.
A little brown satchel full of cash. Wow, that's a detail you don't forget. And the outcome, what happened?
The consequences were significant. Fall became the first U.S. cabinet member ever imprisoned for a felony committed while in office. And critically, Supreme Court rulings, like McGrain v. Daugherty in 1927, explicitly affirmed Congress's power to investigate the executive branch. That established a really vital check on power.
And then, naturally, came Watergate, which, for a whole generation, just redefined everything about presidential accountability, didn't it?
It really did. Watergate in the 1970s started with that third-rate burglary, but it spiraled into a full-blown constitutional crisis. Beyond the break-in and the cover-up, the investigations uncovered these secret campaign slush funds, financed by millions in illegal corporate contributions, used for political espionage, dirty tricks, that sort of thing. It also brought to light how U.S. corporations were routinely bribing foreign officials to get business overseas. The consequence: a presidential resignation, Nixon, and what some call a big bang of reforms, including the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the FCPA, in '77. That made it a crime for U.S. companies to bribe foreign officials, plus the creation of the Federal Election Commission, the FEC, and the Ethics in Government Act in '78.
Okay, moving forward in time, you mentioned the industrialization of bribery. That sounds ominous. The Odebrecht case seems like a prime example.
Yes, Odebrecht really shows this concept. The giant Brazilian construction firm, Odebrecht, they created a formal, dedicated department within their company, the Division of Structured Operations. It was essentially a professional bribery division.
A bribery division? Seriously?
Seriously. It operated with its own parallel accounting system, totally off the books. Its job was to systematically pay out about $788 million in bribes to politicians, even presidents, across at least 12 countries, mostly in Latin America. And these payments, they secured over 100 lucrative government contracts, generating an estimated $3.2 billion in benefits for Odebrecht. The fallout was just unprecedented political upheaval across Latin America. Impeachments, presidents, and top officials jailed. Huge public protests against this entrenched graft.
So essentially a corporate department dedicated to crime. That takes it to a whole new level. And speaking of outrageous, the 1MDB scandal in Malaysia, that seems to embody modern kleptocracy at its absolute worst. It's almost hard to believe.
It genuinely is hard to wrap your head around. The 1MDB scandal, also in the 2010s, the U.S. Department of Justice called it the largest kleptocracy case to date. Over $4.5 billion was embezzled from a Malaysian sovereign wealth fund, a fund supposedly set up for economic development. Investigators traced funds directly to the personal bank accounts of the prime minister at the time, Najib Razak. And the laundered money. It financed just an astonishingly lavish lifestyle. Luxury real estate in New York, Beverly Hills, a $250 million super yacht, priceless art by Monet and Van Gogh, and even, unbelievably, helped finance the Hollywood film The Wolf of Wall Street.
Wait, The Wolf of Wall Street, funded by stolen Malaysian state money, that's meta. What was the fallout from that?
The fallout was immense. Public outrage was absolutely a decisive factor in Malaysia's historic 2018 election. It ousted the ruling party that had been in power for 61 years. Najib Razak became the first former Malaysian prime minister to be jailed, and it also triggered these massive international asset recovery efforts across at least 6 countries. It really showed the global reach of these schemes.
These stories are just incredible, but they often feel so hidden. How much of this is still happening, unseen, maybe in the shadows of the global financial system?
Well, that's exactly where things like the Panama Papers in 2016 and the Pandora Papers in 2021 come into the picture. These weren't single scandals. They were unprecedented leaks, exposés. They ripped the veil off the incredibly secretive global offshore finance industry. The Panama Papers, that was 11.5 million leaked documents from just one law firm, Mossack Fonseca. It implicated 12 world leaders, 128 public officials, basically laid bare how anonymous shell companies were used to hide wealth, evade taxes, launder money.
So these weren't just isolated cases. They revealed an entire hidden system, a vast shadow economy.
Precisely. And then the Pandora Papers, 5 years later, an even bigger leak, 11.9 million files. It confirms the shadow system wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. It implicated an even wider group of the global elite, 35 world leaders, over 330 public officials. And a really crucial revelation from Pandora was how the United States itself, particularly states like South Dakota and Delaware with their secrecy laws, had become a major hub for secretive offshore wealth. The Panama Papers, they forced Iceland's prime minister to resign and really fueled this global push for beneficial ownership transparency, finding out who really owns these anonymous companies. The Pandora Papers just reinforced all that, ramping up the pressure for stronger anti-money laundering, AML reforms globally.
Okay, let's try and pull this all together. What are the overarching consequences here? Beyond the dramatic stories, the mind-boggling dollar figures, what's the true lasting cost of this kind of corruption for you, the ordinary citizen listening right now?
Well, the financial cost alone, like we said, is staggering. The UN estimates around $3.6 trillion annually lost to bribes and stolen money. The IMF found that in low-income countries, the slice of the national budget going to essential things like education and health, it's about a third lower in the more corrupt nations compared to less corrupt ones. And this isn't abstract. It means, hospitals without medicine, schools without books, critical infrastructure that's either dangerously shoddy or maybe never gets built at all. But honestly, the most profound damage, the deepest cost, is the erosion of that social contract, the loss of faith. When ordinary citizens see a system where the elite seem to operate by completely different rules, where billions can be embezzled, like 1MDB, where fortunes are hidden offshore like the papers revealed, or where public office seems to be for sale, like in the ab scam sting, where U.S. congressmen were caught taking bribes, it just shatters their faith in the fairness, the legitimacy of their own government.
Yeah, I can see how that would happen.
And that loss of trust. It can lead to widespread political apathy. Why bother voting? It can lead to tax evasion. Why should I pay if they don't? And ultimately, it hollows out democratic institutions from the inside. The massive public outrage over 1MDB, remember, directly led to the historic defeat of Malaysia's ruling party after 61 years. That deep public disgust, that cynicism, that's the true, maybe incalculable cost of corruption.
It is disheartening. But you mentioned that cycle, scandal, outrage, and then reform. Has anything actually changed for the better? Has this cycle produced real progress?
Yes, it has. That scandal reform cycle offers some hope, but it highlights a core tension too. Progress, significant progress, is almost always born out of crisis, out of scandal. Teapot Dome, for instance, established Congress's power to investigate the executive, a critical check. Watergate brought us the FCPA, the FEC, the Ethics in Government Act, fundamentally reshaping rules around campaign finance and government ethics in the U.S. The collapse of BCCI, that huge international banking fraud in the early 90s, it led directly to stronger international banking supervision and, interestingly, UK whistleblower protection laws. And more recently, the Panama and Pandora Papers. They've massively accelerated the global push for public beneficial ownership registries, making it harder to hide illicit wealth.
Okay, so the cycle does produce results, but if we're constantly just reacting, doesn't that mean we're always sort of one step behind?
That's the constant challenge, isn't it? This cycle has produced critical safeguards, vital protections. But you're absolutely right. It often means we're reacting. We're patching the vulnerabilities after huge damage has already been done. Getting ahead of the problem, being proactive rather than reactive, that's the real long-term goal.
So where do we stand now in this ongoing battle, this deep dive we're doing? Is the world actually getting cleaner, dirtier, or are we just stuck in this reactive loop?
Well, Transparency International's latest Corruption Perceptions Index, the 2024 CPI, it paints a pretty sobering picture, unfortunately. The global average score is basically stagnant, stuck at a low 43 out of 100. Over two-thirds of countries score below 50, which indicates serious corruption problems. And the report highlights something quite alarming, a link between high corruption levels and the countries most vulnerable to the climate crisis. Corruption actually hinders effective climate action, both mitigation and adaptation.
Wow, that's a stark connection I hadn't really considered. Corruption literally getting in the way of fighting climate change. But efforts are still ongoing, you mentioned.
Yes, definitely. And international cooperation is absolutely crucial here. Look at the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention. It's been ratified by 46 countries now. It criminalizes bribing foreign officials. And it has this rigorous peer review mechanism, countries checking up on each other. This has led to hundreds of sanctions against companies involved in foreign bribery, and it's genuinely driving significant changes in corporate behavior and compliance programs. So it's not all bleak. Progress is being made, albeit slowly sometimes.
Okay, so looking forward then, what does the future hold? How do we finally get ahead of this curve instead of just waiting for the next big scandal to force our hand?
Our sources point towards an escalating technological arms race. It's a really key battleground. AI, machine learning. They're starting to revolutionize how we detect financial crime, analyzing vast data sets for suspicious patterns, flagging potential fraud in real time in ways humans just couldn't before. The World Bank, for example, is already piloting AI tools to help identify tax evaders, to scrutinize public spending data for hundreds of potential red flags. So that little brown satchel full of cash, it's maybe being replaced by algorithms fighting algorithms.
That's a fascinating shift from physical cash to digital algorithms duking it out. What other strategies are emerging? How do we dismantle that architecture of secrecy you talked about?
Right. Dismantling secrecy is key. A central strategic push for the future is what some are calling radical transparency. This means systematically breaking down the structures that allow secrecy to thrive. It means global implementation of public beneficial ownership registries. No more hiding behind anonymous shell companies. It also means stronger regulation of the so-called enablers of corruption. The lawyers, the accountants, the real estate agents who sometimes facilitate these illicit financial flows. And it demands enhanced international cooperation to trace and recover stolen assets wherever they end up.
And beyond the tech and transparency, you mentioned earlier that corruption is a collective action problem. How does that shape future strategy?
Yeah, that's really where the paradigm shift needs to happen. Recognizing that corruption isn't just a legal issue, solvable by laws alone. It's deeply rooted in social norms and weak institutions in expectations. So future strategies are moving beyond just punishment. They're focusing on building a genuine culture of integrity, empowering civil society groups, protecting a free press, enabling them to act as independent watchdogs. This kind of holistic approach, combining the tech, the transparency, and this broad societal engagement that really seems to be the most promising path forward, that's how we might finally start getting ahead.
So this deep dive has really shown us, hasn't it, that the history of corruption is almost a chronicle of human ingenuity, but perpetually applied to subvert public trust for private gain. We've traced it from ancient patronage and simple bribes right up to these incredibly complex transnational criminal enterprises that can destabilize whole nations and drain trillions from the global economy.
Exactly. And while progress, as we've seen, is often born from crisis, relying only on those reactive reforms just leaves society perpetually vulnerable to the next scheme, the next scandal. The path forward really has to be proactive. It needs that multi-pronged strategy we discussed, making it much harder for illicit wealth to hide, strengthening those core institutions, and fundamentally changing not just the laws, but the underlying norms and expectations about acceptable behavior.
It's clear this is an endless struggle, this fight against the abuse of power for private enrichment. It's ongoing. But as we've seen again and again throughout history, perhaps the most potent weapon in this fight isn't just the latest technology or a new set of laws. It's the relentless demand for accountability that comes from an informed, engaged public. From you. So the question to leave you with is, What aspect of this deep dive, this history of plunder and reform, will you carry forward as you observe the world around you?